My name is Carolyn Whitford. I am 68 years old, a retired schoolteacher, and a widow. For most of my life, I believed in the quiet strength of patience, in the idea that if you gave enough love, it would return to you in some form. That belief carried me through raising my son, through the years of living modestly, and through the nights when my husband Robert and I stayed awake repairing fences on our ranch. But nothing prepared me for the moment my only son looked me in the eye and told me I was no longer family. It happened one late afternoon. The Florida sun was sinking low, painting the ranch in gold. My phone rang, and when I asked Daniel about his wedding date, expecting laughter or maybe a hint of excitement, his voice came flat. His wife, Melissa, chimed in before he could say another word. She said it with a smirk I could hear even through the line. "Oh, we got married last night. It was for family only." Family only. I stood frozen in my kitchen, my hand gripping the counter so tightly my knuckles turned white. Family only. And yet, I was not there. The mother who raised him. The woman who bought his first car when the engine gave out. The teacher who stayed up grading papers at night to pay his college tuition. The widow who sacrificed every ounce of energy to keep his world safe. Melissa's voice lingered like smoke. The word family twisted into something sharp, cutting me deeper than I thought possible. I tried to steady myself, telling my heart not to shatter, but it cracked anyway. 3 days later, the phone rang again. This time, Melissa's tone was casual, almost impatient. "We're ready to move in." "Did you send the keys to the ranch yet?" The ranch. My ranch. The land Robert and I built with our bare hands. Acres of rolling pasture, barns we painted ourselves, soil that still carries the marks of his boots. A home worth $5 million. But to me, it was never about the number. It was about the roses he planted near the porch, the kitchen table we carved initials into, the balcony where we once watched storms roll across the plains. "Excuse me," I asked, though I had heard every word. "The keys," she repeated, her voice sharper now. "To the ranch. Ethan and I are moving in. It is time you let us start our life there." Her entitlement was staggering. They had excluded me from their wedding, humiliated me, and now demanded the very roof over my head. For a long moment, I could not breathe. My heart pounded as if it were trying to warn me of something far more dangerous than insult. Then, in the calmest voice I had left, I said, "Oh, didn't I mention the will?" There was silence on the other end, thick and heavy. For years I had been silent in a different way, writing checks, covering bills, smoothing every rough edge for Daniel. Silence had been my form of love, my endless giving. But this silence, the one that followed my words, was different. This silence was power. Melissa stiffened. I could hear it in her pause. Daniel shuffled awkwardly beside her, his voice trying to break through. But I ended the call before he could say anything more. My hand trembled, not from weakness, but from the realization that something inside me had shifted. That night, I walked through the ranch with the keys in my pocket. I locked every door, tested every bolt, pressed my hand against the cool wood of the front door as if Robert's palm were still there beside mine. For the first time in years, I felt not despair, but control. They thought I was a woman too tired to resist, a mother too soft to draw a line. They thought I would simply hand them the keys to a $5 million legacy because I was lonely, because I was old, because I was desperate for their presence. But they were wrong. And as I stood by the window, Looking out over the land Robert and I once walked together, I whispered to the night, "The ranch is mine, and it will never be theirs. Not unless they face the truth I've kept locked away in the will." That was the moment I stopped being their endless bank account. That was the moment the machine broke. When I was young, I never imagined my life would be bound to a stretch of land under the wide Florida sky. I thought I would teach children, raise a family, and retire quietly one day. The idea of a ranch seemed distant, almost like a dream meant for someone braver, stronger, or wealthier than me. But life with Robert had a way of transforming the impossible into something solid. Together, we made the impossible our home. Robert was a man of few words. He was not flashy, never the type to boast, but he believed in hard work the way some people believe in scripture. I still remember the day he took me to see the land for the first time. The earth stretched endlessly, flat and bare, the kind of soil that looked like it would swallow seeds rather than grow them. I remember frowning, wondering how on earth this barren place could ever become something worth keeping. But Robert saw what I could not. His eyes were alight as he whispered, "This is where we'll build our future, Caroline. This is where our children will run." I laughed at him then, not because I doubted him, but because I could not yet share his vision. Still, I followed. I always followed, not out of weakness, but because I trusted his compass more than my own. The first year was the hardest. We worked side by side, day after day, hauling wood, repairing broken fences, and sleeping in a drafty trailer that rattled with every storm. I taught during the day and graded papers late at night by the light of a lantern, while Robert hammered boards until his knuckles bled. My hands were raw from pulling weeds and scrubbing clothes in a metal tub. Yet every night, when I collapsed onto the thin mattress, I felt a strange kind of fullness. Exhaustion, yes, but also pride. There is one memory that returns to me most often, one that still warms me, even in the coldest silences of this house. Robert had been building the front porch, determined to give me a place to sip tea while watching the horizon. It was July, and the sun was merciless. His shirt clung to him, soaked through, his face streaked with dirt. I had begged him to rest, but he refused. "A ranch without a porch," he said, "isn't a home at all." When he finally hammered the last nail, he pulled something from his pocket. It was a small silver key, its surface already tarnished from his sweat. "This isn't just for doors," he said, pressing it into my palm. "This is for you. A promise that no matter how tired we get, this place will always belong to us." That key became my anchor. I wore it on a chain for years, and even now it rests in the drawer by my bed. Whenever storms rolled in, whenever the bank called about late payments, whenever Robert and I argued over bills, I touched that key. It reminded me that our struggle had meaning. Over time, the land softened. Grass began to grow, then crops. The barns filled with animals. We planted roses along the fence line, red and vibrant against the rough wood. Robert liked to joke that even the land had finally realized we were too stubborn to give up. When Daniel was born, the ranch was still rough, but it was ours. I remember cradling him on the porch, the same porch Robert built with his own hands, whispering that this land would one day be his. He gurgled, reaching toward the sky as if he already understood. But life is not a straight path. There were droughts, debts, and nights when I lay awake wondering if we had made a terrible mistake. There were winters when the pipes froze, when Robert caught pneumonia, and I feared losing him too soon. Yet every hardship became part of the ranch's story, stitched into its soil. When Robert died, the ranch became more than a home. It became his memory. Every nail, every fence post, every field reminded me of him. I walked the land after his funeral, tracing my fingers over the weathered wood he had cut, listening to the echo of his laughter in the wind. I thought I would sell it then, thought I could not bear the weight of keeping it alone, but I could not let it go. It was the last piece of him I had left. Now, as I look back, I see how naive it was to assume Daniel would cherish it the way we did. To him, perhaps, it is nothing more than acres worth $5 million. To Melissa, it is simply power, a symbol of luxury she feels entitled to. But for me, every inch of this land carries a memory, a sacrifice, a love story etched in dirt and sweat. When they demanded the keys, I remembered that silver key Robert once pressed into my hand. I remembered his promise, and mine in return. This ranch was not a gift to be stolen by entitlement. It was a testament. And I, the quiet keeper of its history, was not ready to surrender. I used to believe that a wedding was not only about two people joining their lives, but about families weaving together, about laughter spilling across generations, about new bonds forming under the weight of vows. My own wedding to Robert had been modest. A white dress borrowed from my sister Grace, a church decorated with paper flowers made by my students, and a reception where neighbors brought casseroles because we could not afford catering. Yet it was joyous. I remember Robert's hand trembling as he slipped the ring on my finger, his voice breaking when he promised to love me until death parted us. I never forgot the way my parents cried as they danced, or the way Grace whispered in my ear, "You are family now, in every way that matters." That was the memory that replayed in my mind the night I discovered Daniel had married without me. I had called him with the gentle excitement only a mother can feel. I wanted to ask about the date, to start planning what dress I might wear, to know if they had chosen a church or a garden. Instead, Melissa's voice cut through like glass. "Oh, we got married last night. It was for family only." Family only. The words clung to me, heavy and sharp. I looked around my quiet kitchen, the scent of stew still lingering from dinner, and realized that in their eyes, I no longer qualified as family. I set the phone down carefully, as though any sudden movement would shatter me completely. My legs weakened, and I had to grip the counter to steady myself. I wanted to cry, but no tears came. What arrived instead was a hollow ache, like someone had scooped out the center of me and left an empty shell. I walked to the cabinet where I kept old albums. With trembling hands, I pulled out the thick book from the top shelf. Inside were photographs of Robert and me on our wedding day. His smile, wide and certain. My veil, crooked from rushing out of the dressing room. The guests, neighbors, and family who had given us their blessing even though we had so little. Turning the pages, I could not ignore the contrast. My wedding had been about togetherness, about community. Daniel's wedding had been about exclusion, about erasing me from the frame. I tried to imagine what the photographs from his ceremony looked like. Melissa beaming, Daniel looking nervous, perhaps their friends cheering. But in those images, there would be a gap, an absence where a mother should have been standing. I set the album on the table and stared at it for a long time. The silence in the ranch pressed in on me. Even the hum of the refrigerator felt accusatory, reminding me that I had spent 3 years paying their rent, their groceries, even Melissa's lavender gown. I had written checks in good faith, thinking each one was an investment in Daniel's happiness. I believed I was being invited into his future. Instead, I had been written out entirely. The pain of that realization was sharper than any knife. It was not just that they had married. It was that they had done so deliberately, making a statement. I was no longer necessary, no longer worthy of witnessing the milestone of my own child. I remember walking out onto the porch that night, clutching the album to my chest. The air smelled of hay and roses. Above me, the stars burned indifferent to my grief. I thought of Robert then, how he would have fought for me to be there. He would have reminded Daniel of the years I carried him through illness, of the nights I stayed awake soothing his nightmares, of the mornings I packed his lunches before heading to work. He would have said, "Family is not something you choose when it is convenient. Family is the blood that carried you here." But Robert was gone, and I was left to face the cruelty alone. I sank into the porch chair, the wood creaking beneath me, and opened the album once more. I traced Robert's face with my fingertip, whispering to him as though he were listening. They called it family only, Robert. Family only, and somehow I am not family anymore. The night answered only with the chirping of crickets, the low rumble of cattle shifting in the pasture. Yet even in the silence, I felt a fire stirring deep inside me. Not rage, not yet, but something heavier, quieter, a knowledge that my patience had reached its edge. When the phone rang again 3 days later and Melissa demanded the keys to the ranch, the album was still sitting on the table, open to the photo of Robert sliding the ring onto my finger. My eyes lingered on that image as I lifted the receiver, and I felt his presence steadying me. It gave me the strength to answer with calm defiance, to plant the seed of resistance with one sentence. "Didn't I mention the will?" That was when the hollow ache inside me began to shift. Grief turned into clarity, and I knew, deep in my bones, that being erased from their wedding was not the end of me. It was the beginning of something else entirely. The night after Melissa demanded the keys to the ranch, I barely slept. I lay awake in my bed, the silver key Robert once gave me resting on the nightstand, its surface catching faint light from the moon. My fingers brushed against it again and again as though it were a lifeline. In my mind, her words replayed with a cruel rhythm. "We're ready to move in. Did you send the keys?" Each repetition cut deeper, not because of the audacity itself, but because Daniel stood silently beside her, letting her voice become his. By morning, the exhaustion had settled into my bones, but so had something else, a clarity that felt both foreign and steady. I walked into the kitchen, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat at the dining table where stacks of receipts and bills lay scattered. Each slip of paper was proof of what I had given. 3 years of rent, groceries, gifts, car repairs. It totaled $77,500. I whispered the number aloud, letting it hang in the air like a verdict. 77,500, and now they want the ranch. The phone rang again that afternoon. I recognized Melissa's clipped tone immediately. She did not bother with greetings. "Caroline, I hope you're not planning to make this difficult. We've already told people the ranch is ours. It'll be embarrassing for everyone if you resist." I stared at the sunlight cutting across the floor, my silence stretching between us. She mistook it for hesitation. "Think about Daniel. Don't you want him to have security? To start a family here? It's the least you can do after everything he's been through." I almost laughed then. The least I could do? After 3 years of covering every one of their needs while they cut me out of their most important day? My silence grew heavier, thicker, until finally I said quietly, "This is my home." And then I hung up. Later, as evening fell, my neighbor Nora came by with a basket of peaches. She had known me since Robert and I first moved to the land. We sat together on the porch, the fading light painting the fields in amber. I told her everything about the wedding I had not been invited to, the demand for the keys, Melissa's smug certainty. Nora's eyes narrowed as she listened. "If it were me," she said finally, her voice sharp as a blade, "I'd cut them off completely. A child who treats his mother like that has already made his choice. Why keep giving?" Her words landed heavily. I stared at the peach in my hand, its skin soft against my palm. "Because he's my son," I whispered, "and I keep hoping he'll remember that I am his mother." "Hope is not the same as love," Nora replied. "Love is what you gave him. Hope is what he keeps stealing from you." Her honesty hurt, but it also stirred something inside me. It was easier to believe I was just unlucky, just overlooked, than to admit my son was complicit in my erasure. Nora forced me to face the truth. After she left, I walked back inside and opened the old wooden cabinet in the hallway. Inside was a box where Robert and I had kept our most important papers: insurance policies, savings accounts, and tucked carefully in a manila envelope. My will. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, scanning the familiar lines. The ranch, by default, would pass to Daniel if I died. That had been my assumption all along. I had believed it was an inheritance he would treasure. But as I stood there with the paper in my hands, I felt a shift. I realized that keeping things the same would only reward their cruelty. The ranch was more than land. It was history, love, sacrifice. To hand it over to people who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle felt like burying Robert's memory alive. I closed the envelope, my decision not yet formed, but my resolve hardening. If Melissa thought silence meant surrender, she was wrong. My silence would be the kind that unsettled, the kind that spoke louder than shouting ever could. That night, I walked through each room, locking doors, checking windows, running my hand along the walls. The ranch seemed to breathe with me, as though it understood the threat that loomed. Standing at the window, I whispered to Robert, as if he were just outside tending the fields. "They think I'm weak. They think I'll give in, but I'm not ready to hand over your life's work. Not to them." The wind stirred the roses outside, their thorns catching moonlight. For years, I had believed that silence was the language of endurance. Now I saw it differently. Silence could also be the language of resistance. The escalation had begun. And though I did not yet know where it would end, I knew one truth with absolute certainty. I was no longer the woman who would simply hand over the keys. The morning they arrived, the air felt heavier than usual, as if the ranch itself sensed the intrusion. I had woken early, fed the horses, and walked the perimeter of the fields with the silver key in my pocket. My breath came steady, but my heart beat a rhythm of dread and defiance. When I returned to the house, a cloud of dust trailed up the road. Their car. I watched from the porch as Daniel's old sedan pulled into the driveway, the trunk packed high with suitcases, cardboard boxes, and plastic bins. Melissa was the first to step out. She wore oversized sunglasses and carried herself as though she were already the mistress of the ranch. Her heels sank into the dirt, but she didn't notice. She was too busy surveying the land with a look of satisfaction. Daniel followed, slower, dragging 2 bags from the trunk. He avoided my eyes at first, as though he knew what his silence had already cost. "Mother," he said finally, his tone rehearsed, polite but detached. "Daniel," I replied, keeping my voice even. Melissa didn't waste time. She walked straight toward me, her smile sharp. "Caroline, we thought it would be easier to just bring our things now. Fresh start, right? It's time we settled in." I stayed seated in my chair, the silver key clutched tightly in my hand, hidden in the folds of my skirt. I let her words hang in the air, the silence between us stretching long enough to unnerve even her. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Melissa before speaking. "We just thought it was the right time. You shouldn't be living here alone. It's too much for you." His concern might have sounded genuine to someone else, but to me, it was hollow. I remembered the sound of Melissa's voice over the phone. "Did you send the keys?" And I knew this wasn't about care. It was about possession. "This ranch is not too much for me," I said softly. "It is exactly enough." Melissa's smile faltered, but only for a moment. She gestured toward the car. "We've already told people we're moving in. My family is coming by later this week to help. Daniel's friends are excited too. It would be embarrassing if you made this difficult." There it was again, that word, embarrassing, as if my role in their story was simply to stay quiet and not ruin their image. I rose slowly from my chair, the wood creaking beneath me. I looked at Daniel, not her. "Did you tell her whose hands built this place?" I asked him. "Did you tell her what it cost?" He swallowed hard, but said nothing. Melissa waved a hand dismissively. "We don't need to rehash ancient history. What matters is the future, and the future is us here, building our life." Her confidence would have been almost admirable if it weren't so cruel. She walked past me toward the door, reaching for the knob as though she owned it. My hand shot out before she could turn it. The silver key pressed cold into my palm. "No," I said firmly. She froze, startled by the strength in my voice. Daniel looked at me then, truly looked, perhaps realizing for the first time that his mother was not going to yield. Melissa laughed lightly, but the sound was brittle. "Carolyn, don't be dramatic. This is inevitable. You can't stop it." I let the silence answer her. Silence that carried decades of sacrifice, nights without sleep, years of standing beside Robert through storms and debt and illness. Silence that spoke of love deeper than any demand could erase. Finally, I stepped back, but not toward the door. Instead, I turned and walked into the house through the side entrance, locking the door behind me. From the window, I watched them unload their bags onto the porch, muttering between themselves. Daniel's shoulders slumped, his steps heavy. Melissa's gestures grew sharp, her lips tight with irritation. I brewed tea, my hands steady though my heart pounded. I knew this was only the beginning. They would not back down easily, but neither would I. As the kettle whistled, I thought of Nora's words. "Hope is what he keeps stealing from you." Perhaps she was right, but there was still one thing they had not stolen, and would never steal: my will, both the document and the strength it represented. By evening, their suitcases still sat on the porch, untouched by my hand. I ate dinner alone at the kitchen table, the ranch quiet around me. Outside, I could hear Melissa's voice rising in frustration, Daniel's quieter murmur trying to calm her. I did not go to the door. I did not invite them in. That night, I placed the silver key back in the drawer by my bed. I lay down, listening to the restless wind against the windows, and whispered into the dark, "This is still my home." And though fear lingered at the edges of my mind, a stronger truth settled deep in my chest. The ranch would not be surrendered with ease, not to demands, not to entitlement, and certainly not to silence imposed by others. My silence was mine to wield, and it had just begun to speak. That night, after refusing them entry, I sat by the window in my bedroom, the lamp casting a warm circle of light on the quilt Robert's mother had made. Outside, their suitcases still lined the porch, but I did not move to bring them in. Instead, I let my eyes wander over the silver key on the nightstand, and my thoughts drifted backward to years when Daniel was still small and the ranch echoed with laughter instead of demands. I remember the winter Daniel turned 6. The pipes froze, and Robert and I worked through the night to keep water running. Daniel woke to find us shivering in the kitchen, our hands red from the cold. He toddled in, clutching the little blanket I had sewn for him. "Here, Mama," he said, wrapping it clumsily around my shoulders. In that moment, the exhaustion vanished, replaced by the warmth of his innocent love. Raising him was never easy. My salary as a teacher barely covered the basics. Many nights, I stayed up grading papers at the kitchen table while Daniel slept in the next room. I remember boiling pasta 3 nights in a row, stretching sauce as thin as I could, while Daniel giggled, calling it his noodle feast. He never knew that I sometimes skipped my own portion to make sure he had enough. Robert and I wanted Daniel to have opportunities we had never known. When his school announced a trip to Washington, D.C., we knew we could not afford it. But Robert picked up extra shifts, and I took on tutoring after school. The night before the trip, Daniel ran around the house, too excited to sleep, his small suitcase packed neatly by the door. His joy made every extra hour worth it. I can still hear the sound of his laughter bouncing off the porch when he was 10, running with a kite that refused to catch the wind. Robert held the frame high while I cheered from the steps. And when the kite finally lifted, Daniel's shout rang across the fields. Those were the days when family was simple, when love did not come with conditions or demands. But as Daniel grew older, something shifted. He wanted more than what we could give. He compared himself to classmates with newer clothes, larger homes, parents who could afford cars without dents, and vacations without debt. I did my best to reassure him, telling him that value was not measured in possessions. Yet I saw the way his eyes lingered on what we lacked. When Robert fell ill, Daniel was 17. The weight of responsibility grew heavier on me. I took on 2 jobs, teaching during the day and cleaning offices at night. Some evenings, Daniel would sit at the kitchen table, his books open, pretending to study. I noticed the weariness in his face, the resentment flickering when his friends invited him out and he had to stay home. Still, I reminded myself he was just a boy on the edge of becoming a man. I was proud the day he graduated high school. I clapped until my hands ached, tears streaming as he crossed the stage. I had sewn the hem of his gown the night before, because it had torn, and he never knew. Later, when he wanted to attend college, the costs were daunting. I cashed in Robert's life insurance and took out loans. Education is the one. Inheritance I can guarantee, I told him. During those years, I denied myself small comforts. I wore the same winter coat for 8 seasons. I drove a car that coughed smoke every morning. Every paycheck went first to his tuition, his books, his apartment. When Daniel thanked me, his words sounded rehearsed, but I accepted them anyway. I told myself gratitude was not always loud. Sometimes it was hidden. Now, as I sit in this house surrounded by memories, I realize I may have confused silence with acceptance. I thought that by giving endlessly, Daniel would understand the depth of my love. I thought he would see the sacrifices carved into every corner of this ranch. Instead, he grew accustomed to them, as if they were not sacrifices at all, but simply the way life was meant to be. Looking back, I wonder if I should have said no more often. Should I have let him struggle so he might learn resilience? Should I have drawn lines so he would know love is not the same as indulgence? These questions press on me now, heavier than any mortgage payment ever did. As I stared into the night, the voices of the past grew louder than the muffled arguments outside. I could hear Daniel as a boy, shouting with joy when the kite took flight. I could see him at 6, wrapping his tiny blanket around my shoulders. Those memories clash with the present, the silence of his eyes as Melissa speaks for him, the absence of his hand when I needed him most. I closed the curtains, shutting out the porch where their suitcases waited like vultures. My heart ached, but not from regret. It ached because I finally understood. I had given him everything I could, and yet he had chosen someone else's voice over mine. Still, I whispered into the dark, as though Daniel were once again the boy with the kite. "You were my whole world, son. I hope one day you remember." The following week, Melissa changed her tactics. When my silence did not yield, she decided to turn the eyes of others against me. I should have expected it. She had always cared more about appearances than truths. It began with whispers. Nora came by one afternoon, her brow furrowed. "Caroline," she said gently, "I ran into Melissa at the market. She told people you were confused lately, that maybe the ranch was too much for you." The words stung, though Nora spoke them kindly. I forced myself to smile, but my stomach tightened. Confused. Too much for me. It was a calculated insult, carefully designed to sound like concern. Within days, I noticed changes. Neighbors who once greeted me warmly now gave hesitant smiles. At church, someone patted my shoulder a little too gently, as if I were fragile glass. Melissa's performance had begun. She painted herself as the dutiful daughter-in-law, trying to step in for an aging widow who couldn't manage alone. One evening, as I returned from the feed store, I saw cars parked along the road outside the ranch. Laughter drifted through the air. Melissa had invited her friends for what she called a welcome gathering. I had not been asked. From the porch, I could hear her voice rising above the others. "We'll be moving in soon. Daniel and I are making plans to renovate. It's going to be spectacular." My chest tightened as I listened from the shadows of the driveway. The guests clapped politely, sipping their wine glasses. They did not know that I was still inside the house, that my bed and photographs and memories still filled every room. To them, Melissa's version was reality. I stepped quietly inside, my feet moving across the wooden floors I had polished for decades. In the kitchen, I set down the bags of feed and stood still, letting the sound of their celebration seep through the walls. I thought of all the gatherings Robert and I had once hosted here. Barn dances where fiddles played, dinners where laughter rolled louder than the thunder outside. This was not laughter. This was conquest disguised as festivity. Later that night, when the cars finally left, I opened the door and saw Melissa arranging flowers on the porch table. She startled at the sight of me. "Oh," she said with a smile too sweet to be genuine. "We didn't want to disturb you. Everyone is just so excited for this new chapter. I think they'll be relieved once you've transitioned." "Transitioned?" I asked, my voice calm but cold. She tilted her head. "You know, to something smaller, easier. A condo, maybe. It's time, Caroline. You deserve rest." Her words dripped with false kindness, but her eyes gleamed with victory. I did not answer. I turned, closed the door behind me, and locked it with the silver key still warm in my hand. My silence unsettled her more than anger ever could. The pressure grew heavier in the days that followed. A letter arrived from a cousin I had not spoken to in years. "Caroline, Melissa tells me you're struggling. Why not let them help?" Even my mailbox had become a tool in her campaign. I could feel the weight of judgment pressing on me from all sides. Yet in that pressure, I discovered something unexpected. The more Melissa tried to convince the world I was frail, the stronger I became in my resolve. Each whisper only reminded me of what was true. I was not weak. I had built this life, brick by brick, choice by choice. My silence was not confusion, it was clarity. One afternoon, as I walked through town, I overheard two women speaking by the bakery. "Poor Daniel," one said. "His mother clings to that ranch. It's selfish, really." I wanted to step in, to defend myself, to explain the years of sacrifice and the history soaked into that soil. But I didn't. Instead, I walked on, my back straight, my lips pressed into a quiet line. Let them believe what they wanted. The truth did not need their approval. That night, I pulled out the envelope with my will again. I spread the papers across the table, the ink steady beneath my fingers. Melissa could gather her crowds, spread her lies, win sympathy with her charm. But she did not hold this paper. She did not control the law. For the first time, I realized the irony. She thought silence was weakness. Yet in the silence, I was preparing the one move that would end her illusions. My power did not need applause or allies. It needed patience. As I folded the papers and slid them back into the envelope, I whispered into the dim kitchen, "Let them talk. Let them gather. When the time comes, it won't be me who stands embarrassed." The ranch was quiet again, but in that quiet, I heard something stronger than all the voices Melissa had gathered against me. I heard resolve, steady, unshakable, waiting. I did not call anyone out of bravado. I called them because I needed help that was practical, clear, and legal. The first call I made was to Mr. Harrington. He had been my husband's friend since before I was born. He had winked at Robert across a courtroom once, and later he had eaten Rob's undercooked barbecue like it was Michelin star. He knew our names. He knew our story. And he had always been quietly on our side. When I walked into his office, the smell of old books and leather settled around me like a familiar coat. I did not cry. I sat down, placed the envelope with the rental receipts and bank statements on his desk, and said plainly, "They expect me to hand them the ranch. They want the keys. They lied about family. I need to make sure they cannot take what was not theirs to take." He listened without interruption, folding his fingers, his face a calm map of experience. "Show me everything," he said. "Every transfer, every memo. If they are building a narrative of incapacity, we will build a different narrative, one built on facts." He spoke slowly, like someone laying stones for a wall. That was exactly what I needed. Not theatrics. Stones. We drafted a plan. First, I would stop the automatic transfers. For 3 years, I had set up payments because it was easier than the pleadings and the phone calls. The bank teller did not judge me when I signed the forms. He only raised an eyebrow when he saw the totals. It felt like ripping a bandage off a wound that had always been infected. The transfers were stopped that afternoon. I watched the teller initial the form and felt a small, private triumph. Next, we documented everything. Mr. Harrington suggested we gather witnesses who could testify to my daily competence. I called Nora, who did not hesitate. She came over with a jar of lemon cookies and a blunt expression. "You want me there? I'll say what I saw," she said, folding her hands over the table. I handed her a list of dates and small incidents. She read them, then looked up with a softness that calmed me. "You did this with dignity, Caroline. I remember the nights you taught the kids to read, the lunches you packed, the time you fixed a broken tractor with nothing but rope and patience." Her recollection was not grand. It was specific. It was proof. We installed cameras the next week. I am not a woman who enjoys gadgets, but the small black lenses felt like honest witnesses. They watched the porch, the driveway, the kitchen door. I recorded their arrival, the way Melissa shuffled boxes and spoke on her phone, the times Daniel lingered in the yard but never stepped over the threshold. I did not set them to catch the private arguments. I set them to catch the truth. The footage would show my routines, my clear mind, the precise way I signed my checks, my steady hands when I turned a page in a book. I was not trying to invade someone's privacy. I was trying to preserve mine. Mr. Harrington recommended a medical evaluation as well. He called it a precaution, and he called Dr. Moore by name. I admit I bristled at the idea at first. The thought of a doctor deciding whether I was fit felt like an accusation that cut deeper than any insult. Yet when I met Dr. Moore, a man with kind eyes and a careful manner, I felt some of that fear ease. He asked me about my daily routine, quizzed me on short lists, and listened when I told him Robert's stories he had never heard. When he said he would write the report, he did not look like a juror. He looked like someone who had seen enough to know when a life is intact. There was one document I had avoided for years. It was a new will, drafted quietly after Robert's funeral. I had not finalized it because grief makes you indecisive in small ways. The old assumptions that the ranch would pass to Daniel had been comfortable. Now, comfort felt like an accomplice. Mr. Harrington sat across from me and explained clearly how a properly executed will could prevent the kind of opportunism I faced. He suggested that I could protect the land by specifying conditions, by designating a charitable trust, by naming guardians for specific assets. These were not tricks. They were safeguarding measures. So I wrote, I rewrote. I sat at the dining table with the album open and the silver key beside me, and I dictated what mattered. Not in spite of Daniel, but because of what Robert and I had built. I named the ranch as a legacy not for a single heir to squander. I stipulated that if a beneficiary attempted to seize it while I lived, there would be legal consequences. I arranged for a portion of the proceeds to fund a community program I had always wanted, a place where kids from town could learn farming and stewardship. I wanted the land to teach, not just to be fought over. People imagine revenge as loud and vindictive. Mine was quiet and precise. It smelled of paper and ink more than malice. It required patience and a willingness to hold the line. When Melissa boasted to neighbors that she would simply walk in and claim the keys, she did not know the legal house I had begun to build around the ranch. There were practical things, too. I changed the locks. I called the bank and set controls on who could access accounts. I made copies of old checks, dates stamped and clear. I wrote down every gift, every payment, everything that had once felt like invisible labor. I turned the intangible into evidence. At night, when the house was still and the stars marched across the sky, I would sit with the will in my lap and feel Robert's presence in the way the floorboards creaked, in the scent of his pipe lingering in the study. My preparation was not born from hatred. It was an act of fidelity to a life we had promised one another. If that sounded dramatic, perhaps it was. But fidelity is simple. It is the act of keeping a promise, even when the world tries to make you forget it. The countermove was not a single blow. It was a steady unspooling of truth. I was not trying to take their future away. I was trying to ensure that my past was respected. And in doing so, I discovered a resource I had not expected: my own certainty. It was a Tuesday evening when Daniel finally walked into my kitchen without Melissa by his side. The air outside had been heavy with rain, and he came in damp, his shoes leaving tracks on the floorboards Robert once sanded by hand. I sat at the table, with a cup of tea cooling in front of me, the silver key lying beside it like a silent witness. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, his eyes shifting between me and the floor. For a long while, he said nothing. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to fill the space between us. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mom," he began, his voice rough, "I need to talk to you, alone." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Then sit, Daniel." He slid into the chair, shoulders hunched, hands clasped tightly together. He looked less like a grown man and more like the boy who once came home after missing curfew, desperate to explain. Only this time, the stakes were not curfews. They were legacies. "I know Melissa can be direct," he started. "But you need to understand, we're under a lot of pressure. Debts, expectations. I thought moving into the ranch would solve things. It's big enough, valuable enough. It could set us up for life." I kept my gaze steady on him, my hands folded neatly in my lap. He shifted uncomfortably. "Daniel," I said softly, "do you hear yourself? You talk as though this ranch were a lottery ticket. Not a home, not your father's sweat, not my years of sacrifice, just numbers." He flinched, but pressed on. "We didn't mean to exclude you from the wedding. Melissa thought—" "Stop." My voice cut through before he could finish. "Don't tell me what Melissa thought. Tell me what you thought. Was I not family to you?" His mouth opened, then closed. He lowered his head, shame flickering across his face. "I didn't fight her on it," he admitted. "I should have. But I was tired, Mom. Tired of always disappointing her. She said it was easier this way, and I went along with it." The ache in my chest deepened, but I stayed silent. I let him sit in the weight of his own confession. He rubbed his temples, his voice growing desperate. "I need you to help us. Just this once more. If you sign the ranch over, or even part of it, I promise we'll take care of you. You won't have to worry about anything." I almost laughed. The irony was too sharp. "Take care of me?" I asked quietly. "I've been taking care of you since the day you were born, when your father was sick, when money was short, when you wanted school trips and college and apartments. Who carried that weight? And now, after all that, you offer to take care of me with what is already mine." He winced, his hands tightening. "I didn't come here to fight." "Then what did you come for?" I asked, leaning forward. "Did you come to remember who you are? Or only to convince me to surrender?" His eyes filled with tears, and for a fleeting second, I saw the boy with the kite again, laughing in the wind. But that vision slipped quickly, replaced by the man who had chosen silence at his wedding, silence in the face of Melissa's cruelty. "I'm scared," he whispered finally. "We owe more money than you know. If Melissa leaves me—" "If Melissa leaves you," I interrupted, "you will still be my son. But you will not buy loyalty with land that is not yours." The silence grew thick again, heavier than before. He looked at me as if searching for the mother who once soothed his nightmares. And I looked at him as if searching for the son who once wrapped a blanket around my shoulders in the cold. We were both searching, but in different directions. Finally, I stood. I picked up the silver key and slipped it back into my pocket. "Daniel," I said, my voice steady, "I will not give you the ranch. Not to you. Not to Melissa. Not under these terms. This home is not a solution to your debts. It is not a prize to be claimed. It is my life's work. And your father's." He bowed his head, his shoulders trembling. "So that's it?" "That's it," I said. "You still have me as your mother. But the ranch is not yours to demand." He left quietly, his footsteps dragging across the floor. When the door shut behind him, the kitchen filled again with silence. But this silence was different. It was not defeat. It was strength. I sat back at the table, my tea long gone cold, and whispered into the empty room. Some things can be forgiven. Others must be protected. 2 days after Daniel sat in my kitchen, the first knock came at noon. I opened the door to find Melissa on the porch with a man in a tailored suit and a neighbor I barely knew. The suited man introduced himself as Pierce Calloway, counsel for my son and his wife. "Mrs. Whitford," he said, smiling without warmth, "we are here to ensure everything is in order. We would appreciate a quick look at your financial records and a conversation about safety on the property." I did not move aside. "I do not consent to any search," I answered. "If you have questions, direct them to my attorney, Mr. Harrington." "There is no need to be difficult," Melissa said. "Everyone is worried about you." The neighbor spoke up. His name was Clint Davies. He lifted his chin and claimed he had observed troubled behavior. He said I argued with no one, left doors open at night, and wandered along the road after dark. I thought of the cameras I had installed and the dates I had kept. My voice stayed soft. "Mr. Davies, did you see me, or did you hear a story and decide to borrow it?" Calloway cut in. "We will be filing a petition if cooperation is not forthcoming." I held the door with my hand and felt the silver key in my pocket. "Then file it," I said. "But you will not enter my home." They left an envelope on the mat. Inside was a letter hinting at guardianship, layered in polite threats. I set it on the table, boiled water for tea, and called Harrington. He told me to document and trust the paper trail. The next knock arrived the following morning. A young man from the pharmacy stood on my porch. He identified himself as Aaron Talbot, and he carried a statement already signed. According to the page, I had shown confusion over a dosage and mixed up refills more than once. His glance slid toward the idling car where Melissa waited. "Mr. Talbot," I said, "do you remember when I asked you to confirm a brand swap after my insurer changed suppliers?" He nodded, grateful for the reminder. "Yes, ma'am. Did I appear confused, or did I ask you to check the milligrams because the bottle looked different?" He swallowed. "You asked me to check. Then why is your statement different?" He winced. I felt pressured. "Withdraw it," I said. "Call Harrington's office and tell them the truth." He nodded, eyes down, and stepped off the porch. By dusk, a third thread appeared. A message spread at church that I had misplaced a bank card and accused a clerk of stealing it. In truth, the card had slipped between two receipts in my wallet. I found it the same afternoon and thanked the clerk. I did not chase the rumor. I logged the date and time. Then I slid the note into a folder labeled False Claims. That night, I set the folder beside the will and watched the ranch windows darken against the sky. I thought about the nature of testimony. People imagine truth as a bell that rings clear and loud. In real life, truth is a steady tone you must learn to hold while noise gathers all around. I brewed chamomile and laid out receipts, camera stills, and a timeline for Harrington. I added the letter from Callaway. I added the rumor about the bank card with the clerk's name attached. Evidence is patience. The following afternoon, Callaway returned with Melissa, but this time I did not answer alone. Nora sat at my table with a pad of paper and a pen. When Callaway asked again, "For records," Nora smiled and said, "You may speak to Mr. Harrington. Until then, please step off the porch." "Mrs. Whitford," Callaway said, "our petition will state you need protective oversight." "My life does not require rescue," I replied. "It requires respect." He asked whether I would at least disclose medication lists. "No," I said. "That is private. And if you submit false statements, we will answer with sworn affidavits and recordings." He studied my face, searching for the confusion he hoped to cite. When they left, Nora reached for my hand. "They will make more noise," she said. "Hold your line." I nodded. I had already scheduled the evaluation with Dr. Moore. I had already stopped the transfers and set bank controls. The ranch felt quiet behind our closed door, not fragile, but braced. Outside, the wind moved the roses along the fence. That night, I wrote one more note to myself and tucked it beneath the silver key. When the voices grow louder, turn up the truth. Then I slept without fear. I was ready. After the false witnesses had come and gone, after the envelopes and rumors had piled into my days, I found myself in need of stillness. It was evening, and the ranch was bathed in a soft orange glow. I sat alone at the dining table with my sister Grace's old journal resting in front of me. She had passed years ago, yet her voice lived inside those pages, steady and uncompromising. I opened to an entry she had written in her neat, looping script. Sometimes the loudest answer is silence, not absence, but presence, a silence that refuses to be moved. I read the line again and again, the ink blurring as my eyes watered. Grace had known hardship. She had been widowed young, raising her children with little more than grit and faith. She never shouted when people wronged her. She waited. And in her waiting, she drew lines no one could cross. I placed my hand on the page and let the words settle deep inside me. Melissa and Daniel thought they could erase me with noise, with neighbors, with rumors that bent reality. But Grace's reminder was clear. Silence was not surrender. It was stance. The kettle whistled faintly in the kitchen. I rose slowly, each step deliberate as though I were moving through water. I poured the tea carefully, watching the steam rise. The scent of chamomile filled the air, calming, grounding. My hand trembled as I set the cup on the saucer, but my breath grew steady. I carried the cup back to the table, sat down, and let the warmth seep into my palms. I slowed everything, the sip, the breath, the turning of the page, the rush of accusations, the pounding of Melissa's words, the sting of Daniel's silence. All of it seemed to quiet when I allowed myself to slow. I looked around the room. The wooden beams Robert had sanded, the curtains I had sewn myself, the faint scratches on the floor from Daniel's childhood toys. This was not just a house. It was memory stitched into wood and fabric, a sanctuary built by sacrifice. The ranch was speaking, and it did not shout. It whispered, "Hold steady. Do not be rushed." As I sat in that stillness, I felt my mind sharpen. I recalled dates, receipts, conversations. The lies Melissa had planted unraveled in order. I saw each rumor not as truth, but as noise, clutter I could sort through with patience. I returned to Grace's journal. Another line caught my eye. When you are pushed to shout, whisper instead. Let them wonder what you know. I thought about the courtroom that loomed ahead, the possibility of guardianship petitions, the stories already circulating. They expected me to panic, to crumble, to reveal weakness. But I would whisper instead, through documents, through steady testimony, through the will I had prepared. My gaze shifted to the silver key on the table. I picked it up, its weight cool in my hand. Robert had given it to me decades ago, a promise that the ranch would always belong to us. For years, I had thought of it as a symbol of love. Tonight, I realized it was also a symbol of resolve. I pressed the key into my palm until it left an imprint. The sting grounded me. I whispered into the quiet room, "You gave me this to keep, Robert, and I will keep it, no matter the noise around me." The house answered with creaks and sighs, the way old homes do. But to me, it felt like agreement. I slowed everything again. Tea, breath, thought. I pictured the faces of Melissa and Calloway, their smirks, their practiced lines. And then I pictured myself in the courtroom, calm, steady, armed with truth. Not frantic, not broken, just immovable. For the first time in weeks, peace settled over me, not because the battle was over, but because I understood how to face it. My strength was not in matching their noise. My strength was in holding steady, in letting silence carry more weight than all their shouting. That night, I closed Grace's journal and set it beside the will. I blew out the lamp, the room falling into darkness except for the faint glow of the moon. I lay in bed and whispered the words again, as though they were a prayer. The loudest answer is silence. And as I drifted to sleep, I felt no fear, only readiness. The morning after reading Grace's words, I woke before sunrise with a clarity that felt physical, as if the air had been scrubbed clean. The house was quiet. The fields lay silver under fog. I brewed coffee and set the silver key on the table where I could see it, a small anchor in the pale light. Today would not be about defense. Today would be about drawing a line. I called Mr. Harrington first. He answered on the second ring, steady. I told him I was ready to finalize what we had drafted. He would meet me at noon, bring the documents, and file them by end of day. "You do not have to make a speech," he said, "but you are allowed to speak for yourself." Silence had carried me this far. Now my words would carry the rest. By 10, I sent a simple message to Daniel. "Come by the ranch at 4, without Melissa." He replied with a single word, "Okay." I spent the late morning preparing the kitchen. I cleared the table of papers, leaving only a pitcher of water, 2 glasses, and the key. Then I walked the fence line, touching posts Robert had set with his own hands. Every step steadied me. At noon, Harrington arrived with a folder. We reviewed the signatures. I initialed where he pointed. "Will they have any foothold after this?" "Not unless you give it to them," he said. "Stand firm. Let the paper do its work." He left for the courthouse. At 4, Daniel stepped into the kitchen the way he had as a boy, cautious, as if entering a room he had not earned. I gestured to the chair. He sat. Quietly. "I asked you here without Melissa," I began, "because I want to speak to my son, not to an audience. I am listening." "This will be plain," I said. "You will not move into the ranch. You will not store boxes on the porch. You will not host gatherings. You will not present this house as your own. The keys will not change hands." He swallowed. "Mom." I lifted a hand, not to silence him with force, but to hold the space. What happened with your wedding was not an oversight. It was a choice. What happened after was not a misunderstanding. It was entitlement. I will not reward either. He looked wounded, but I continued. "I have counsel. I have a medical evaluation. I have documented every check I wrote for you. If petitions are filed against me, we will meet them. If rumors rise, we will answer with records. I am not confused, and I am not alone." "So, there is nothing I can say?" he asked. "There is one thing," I said softly. "Tell me the truth. Do you want a mother, or do you want a deed?" He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he looked older than 35. I do not know how to separate the two anymore. I let the silence hold us. Then I set my palm on the table beside the key. "I have made provisions you do not need to fear. I will be safe. The ranch will be safeguarded. It already has its destination, and it is not a bargaining chip." His brow furrowed. "What destination?" "That is not for today," I said. "Today is a boundary. You may visit me by invitation. You may call. You may ask for help if the need is honest and respectful. But you may not claim what you did not build." He stared at the key. "Melissa will not accept this. Then she will have to learn what acceptance means," I replied. "I am not negotiating my life's work." He rose slowly. For a heartbeat, he reached as if to touch my hand, then let it fall. "I thought success meant arriving somewhere bigger," he said. "You keep telling me it means standing somewhere true." "Both can be real," I said, "but only one can be yours now." He nodded once and walked to the door. On the threshold, he paused. "If I come back, will you answer?" "If you come back as my son," I said. "Yes." He left without slamming anything. When the house settled, again I poured a glass of water and carried it to the porch. The fields were turning gold. I set the glass beside the key and felt something inside me unlock. The future widened, not with noise, but with room. The stand had been taken. I did not shout. I did not plead. I named what was mine to protect, and I protected it. Distant thunder rolled. The sky held. The ranch felt lighter, as if it had been waiting for me to say the words out loud. The day of the hearing arrived with skies the color of pewter. I woke before dawn, the ranch still wrapped in silence, and felt the weight of every choice I had made pressing down on me. Yet beneath the heaviness was something steadier. Resolve. I had lived too many years bowing to expectations. Today I would stand in the open, under oath, and say who I was and what I had built. I dressed carefully. A navy suit I had not worn since Robert's funeral, pressed slacks, a pearl brooch he once gave me on our 10th anniversary. The brooch was my anchor. It reminded me that even in absence, love had left me strong. I pinned it high on my collarbone and whispered to the mirror, "You are not a victim. You are Catherine Clark." The courthouse was a 2-story brick building in town, modest but intimidating. Reporters had gathered outside, curious about a case where a son and daughter-in-law sought guardianship of a 70-year-old woman who still managed a working ranch. Their whispers trailed after me as I climbed the steps. I didn't meet their eyes. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with hushed voices. On one side sat Daniel and Melissa, dressed as if for a magazine spread. Melissa wore cream silk and a smile too sharp to be genuine. Daniel kept his gaze lowered, but his posture was rigid, rehearsed. Their attorney, a man named Carlton, organized his papers with theatrical precision. On the other side, I took my seat beside Mr. Harrington, my lawyer, who laid a reassuring hand on my arm. Behind me, in the gallery, I glimpsed Grace, her lined face glowing with quiet encouragement, and two women from the church quilting group. Their presence gave me courage I hadn't known I needed. The bailiff called for order, and Judge Alvarez entered. His robe flowed heavily, his expression unreadable. The gavel struck once. This court is now in session. Carlton stood first, his voice smooth. He painted me as a woman slipping into confusion, forgetting details, mishandling finances. He cited witnesses who claimed I shouted in my driveway, misplaced important documents, acted irrationally. He described Daniel and Melissa as devoted family members stepping in to ensure my safety and preserve the ranch's legacy. As he spoke, Melissa dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, the perfect performance of a concerned daughter-in-law. Daniel remained silent, his face pale. Then came their witnesses. Mr. Davis, my neighbor, testified that he had heard me argue with Daniel. He twisted those confrontations into evidence of paranoia. She accused them of trying to take her land, he said. It seemed delusional. Another, a pharmacist, claimed I had been confused about prescriptions. The most damning, or so they thought, was Dr. Lehman, a psychiatrist I had never met, who declared, based only on secondhand reports, that I displayed early signs of diminished judgment. Each word struck like a stone, but I kept my face calm. Impeccable silence was my shield. When it was Harrington's turn, he rose slowly, letting the tension settle. His voice was low, steady. What the petitioners have presented is not evidence of incapacity, he said, but evidence of exploitation. He held up a thick folder, my financial records, each check, each payment. Mrs. Clark has paid $77,500 over 3 years for her son and daughter-in-law. Rent, groceries, car repairs, even luxuries. Not because she was confused, because she was generous. He introduced Dr. Moore, who had evaluated me thoroughly. The doctor's report was crisp. My memory, reasoning, and judgment were above average for my age. This is not a woman unfit to manage her affairs, he said. This is a woman who has been drained. Then, Harrington displayed the document I had drafted weeks earlier, the no-claim agreement. A woman who sets such conditions is not incompetent. She is foresighted. She is setting boundaries. His voice sharpened. What this case truly reveals is a son and his wife who cannot accept the word no. The room shifted. I could feel the murmurs ripple through the gallery. Judge Alvarez studied me with new eyes. Finally, he asked if I wished to speak. My hands trembled as I rose, but my voice held. I told the truth plainly. The years of sacrifice, the wedding I was excluded from, the demand for my ranch, the $77,500 that had bought not love, but expectation. I was not a mother to them, I said. I was a bottomless vending machine. That machine is broken now. The words landed heavy in the room. Melissa's face flushed red. Daniel's eyes glistened, but he said nothing. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. The petition for guardianship is denied. Mrs. Clark is fully capable of managing her life and estate. This court recognizes her autonomy. Relief surged through me, hot and clean. I sat down, my chest rising like I had climbed out of deep water. Behind me, Grace squeezed my shoulder. In that instant, the ranch felt safe again, not because of the ruling, but because I had stood. When we left the courtroom, reporters crowded the steps, calling questions. I said nothing. Silence was still my power. Inside me, though, a line had been drawn and would never be erased. The courthouse was still echoing in my ears when Harrington guided me down the steps, through the crowd of reporters, and into the quiet of his office a few blocks away. I thought the day was finished. I thought I could go home, close the ranch gates, and breathe. But Harrington had another folder waiting on his desk, heavier than the last. "Catherine," he said gently, "there's one more piece you should see." He slid the folder toward me. My fingers hesitated before lifting the cover. Inside lay a document I had not thought about in years, the will Robert and I had drafted after he was diagnosed. I remembered the night we wrote it. He had sat at the kitchen table, coughing between sentences, insisting that the ranch be protected, that no one, not even Daniel, could use grief as leverage to claim it. We had worked with Harrington back then, and though I had nearly forgotten, Robert's words lived on in black ink. I traced the signature, Robert's steady hand beside mine. For a moment, the room blurred with tears. I whispered, "I thought I was standing alone, but he was standing with me all along." Harrington nodded. "The will was never contested, never revoked. It stipulates that the ranch remains in your name until your passing, and afterward, it passes not directly to Daniel, but into a trust managed by you and two independent trustees. Daniel and Melissa cannot touch it. Not without the trustees' consent, and only if they prove financial responsibility." The words struck me like a bell. All this time I had fought as if my defenses rested only on my shoulders. Yet Robert had built a wall years before, a legal wall stronger than Melissa's entitlement and Daniel's silence. "But why bring it up now?" I asked. My voice was steady, though my heart pounded. "Because Carlton will not stop," Harrington said. "They will appeal, or they will circle back with another strategy. The will is your shield. It proves foresight, protection, and intent. It shows the court this was not last-minute stubbornness. It was a plan years in the making." I leaned back, the pearl brooch at my collar suddenly heavier. "Robert," I whispered inwardly, "you always thought further ahead than I gave you credit for." That evening, I returned to the ranch with the document tucked safely into my handbag. I spread it on the dining room table, beside the stack of receipts and the key. The paper smelled faintly of age, a little yellow at the edges, but it was unshakable. My eyes lingered on the clause Robert had insisted on. To protect the integrity of the ranch and the dignity of the family, no transfer shall occur without proof of stewardship. The phrase carried me back to a night 20 years earlier. Robert had returned from the fields, dust on his boots, and said, "Stewardship, Kathy, that's what matters. Ownership means nothing if you don't care for it." At the time, I thought he was lecturing Daniel about chores. Now I understood he was leaving a map for me. When the phone rang, I half expected Melissa's clipped tone. Instead, it was Daniel. His voice was low, worn. "Mom, Carlton says, we'll appeal. Melissa is furious, but I didn't know Dad had put that in writing." "So you've seen it," I said quietly. Yes, he really didn't trust me. I closed my eyes. It wasn't about trust, Daniel. It was about responsibility. He knew love wasn't enough to keep a ranch alive. He knew paper had to hold what people might forget. Silence stretched between us. Finally, Daniel whispered, "Melissa won't stop." "I know," I said, "but the will stands, and so do I." He exhaled heavily, then ended the call. No threats, no shouting, just the hollow weight of a man realizing the ground beneath him was firmer than he imagined. Later that night, I lit a single lamp in the kitchen and poured tea. The will lay open in front of me. My hands rested on either side of it, palms flat, as if steadying not just the paper, but my life. For the first time since Robert's passing, I felt his presence not as memory, but as partnership. He had not left me defenseless. He had left me armed with dignity. I thought of Melissa's smirk when she demanded the keys. I thought of Daniel's silence at the wedding. And then I thought of the judge's words, the denial of guardianship, and now this will, a fortress Robert had built quietly, knowing storms would come. I whispered into the quiet kitchen, "Didn't I mention the condition?" The phrase, once spoken in defiance, now felt like a legacy. The condition wasn't just mine. It was ours. Robert's foresight, my resolve. When I finally blew out the lamp and climbed the stairs, I carried the will with me, tucked beneath my arm like a shield. The ranch slept around me, the fields dark and endless. I felt not just safe, but rooted. The fight was not over, but the foundation was stronger than ever. And in the stillness, I allowed myself one rare thought. Maybe I was not merely surviving. Maybe I was beginning again. The morning after I held Robert's will in my hands, the air felt different. The ranch was quiet, but not with the heavy quiet of fear. It was a steadier silence, like the pause before sunrise. I brewed coffee and carried the steaming mug out to the porch. The fields rolled wide before me, every fence post a reminder of work done with my own two hands. For months, Melissa had strutted into this house as if it were already hers. For years, Daniel had leaned on my shoulders without ever noticing the weight. Now, the tide had shifted. At 9 o'clock sharp, a black sedan pulled into the drive. Melissa climbed out first, heels striking gravel like weapons. Daniel followed, slower, his eyes downcast. Between them walked Carlton, his leather briefcase swinging. They didn't wait to be invited in. Melissa pushed open the kitchen door, her perfume slicing through the air. "We need to talk," she announced, tossing her sunglasses onto the counter. I remained seated at the table. In front of me lay the will, the receipts, and the silver key. My pearl brooch caught the morning light. "Then talk," I said. My voice was even, not raised, not hurried. Carlton began his practiced speech. "Mrs. Clark, while the court denied guardianship, my clients are pursuing other avenues. There is precedent to contest the will, and frankly, it might be in your best interest to negotiate now rather than endure prolonged litigation." Melissa folded her arms. "We're giving you one last chance to be reasonable. Hand over the keys. Stop making this harder than it needs to be." I let silence fill the room. Once, silence had made me seem weak. Today, it made them shift uncomfortably. When I finally spoke, it was slow and deliberate. "Do you know what stewardship means, Melissa?" Her brow furrowed. "This isn't vocabulary class." "Stewardship," I repeated, "means care, responsibility, and respect for what has been entrusted." Robert believed in stewardship, which is why he and I placed the ranch in a trust, managed by independent trustees. It was never yours to claim. It will never be yours to command. Carlton leaned forward. Mrs. Clark, these things can be challenged. Then challenge them, I said, meeting his eyes. The will is signed. The records are clear. And I am no longer writing checks to subsidize your arrogance. Challenge me, and you will find not confusion, but proof. Not weakness, but paper stronger than your words. Melissa's cheeks flushed crimson. You can't talk to us like that. We are family. I pushed the key gently across the table, then stopped it halfway with my finger. Family doesn't cut a mother from her son's wedding. Family doesn't demand keys as if death were a formality. If you were family, you'd have walked through this door with love. Instead, you came with entitlement. That makes you visitors, not heirs. Daniel's eyes flickered, shame breaking through his practiced silence. Melissa, however, leaned closer, her voice venomous. You'll regret this when you're old and alone. I rose slowly, letting the chair scrape against the tile. My height didn't tower, but the steadiness of my spine filled the room. I would rather be alone than be used. Didn't I mention the condition? The phrase hung in the air, sharp and final. Melissa's mouth opened, then shut again. Carlton cleared his throat, fumbling for composure. Daniel shifted as though he might speak, but no words came. I reached for the will, held it up so they could see Robert's signature beside mine. This is not just a piece of paper. This is foresight. This is protection. This is proof that long before you tried to break me, we prepared for this day. Robert is gone, but his voice is here, and mine is louder than it has ever been. Melissa snatched her sunglasses and stormed toward the door, her heels clattering like gunshots. Carlton followed quickly, muttering about appeals. Daniel lingered, his shoulders slumped. At last, he whispered, Mom, I don't know how to fix this. I softened my gaze, but not my stance. Fix yourself first, Daniel. Then maybe we can talk about family again. He nodded, eyes glassy, then turned to follow his wife. When the door shut, the kitchen settled into silence. I placed the key back in its dish and smoothed the will on the table. For the first time in months, I did not feel cornered. I felt centered. The power reversal was not in shouting, not in vengeance, but in refusing to bend. That evening, I walked the fields alone. The fences stood strong, the horses grazed, the sky burned orange with sunset. I whispered to the air, to Robert, to myself, the machine is broken, the silence is mine, and the ranch is safe. The final hearing arrived sooner than I expected. Carlton filed a motion to reconsider and asked for limited protective oversight, dressed in the language of concern. I woke before dawn, brewed coffee, and slid Robert's will, Dr. Moore's report, and my ledger of payments into my bag. The ranch stood steady in the gray light. The porch boards creaked their old reassurance. I locked the door with the silver key and told the empty hallway I would be home for supper. I was not walking into a battle. I was walking into a room where truth would be spoken aloud and written down. The courthouse felt smaller this time, as if the truth had taken up more space than rumor. Nora met me on the steps and squeezed my fingers. She said she had signed her affidavit and that she would sit behind me. Inside, Mr. Harrington arranged our exhibits with the patience of a farmer setting seed. The will, the evaluation, the retraction letter, camera stills, and the bank confirmations. I sat beside him and breathed slowly, matching the clock's measured tick and letting my body remember how steadiness feels. Carlton began with a polished plea. He called my boundaries stubbornness and my documentation hostility. He insisted Dr. Moore's evaluation was incomplete and that public interest favored oversight. Melissa sat stiff and immaculate. Daniel kept his eyes on the table. Carlton spoke of fairness and transition plans and family unity, words chosen to float like perfume over the absence of fact. When he finished, he looked satisfied, as if a performance could substitute for proof and a headline could replace evidence. Mr. Harrington stood. He entered Robert's will into the record and read the clause about stewardship and trustees. He summarized Dr. Moore's findings: memory, reasoning, and judgment above average. He submitted Nora's affidavit. He produced the pharmacist's retraction. He presented images from my porch camera showing me unlocking gates at dawn, reading invoices at the table, and watering roses at dusk. He said these were the habits of a competent owner, and that the petitioners offered impatience, not evidence, desire, not law. Judge Alvarez leaned forward. He asked Carlton whether any licensed professional had examined me and found incapacity. Carlton answered no. He asked whether Daniel or Melissa possessed any legal right to the ranch while I lived. Again, no. Carlton tried to return to the language of fairness. The judge raised a hand. He said fairness follows facts. Then he turned to me and asked whether I understood my accounts, my property, and my intentions. I named banks, trustees, and the community program the ranch would one day fund. He nodded once. The ruling came careful and complete. The motion to reconsider was denied. The request for protective oversight was denied. The court found no credible evidence of diminished capacity. The court recognized the will and the trust structure as valid expressions of long-standing intent. Then, the judge added a line that changed the air in the room. He issued a protective order on my behalf. No entering my property without invitation, no representing the ranch as theirs to lenders, neighbors, or agents, and no pursuing contact through intermediaries for the purpose of pressure. Carlton objected perfunctorily. Melissa whispered sharply and folded her arms. Daniel finally looked up. What I saw in his face was not rage. It was the dawning understanding that the ground beneath him had become solid, and that it did not belong to him. The judge addressed them both and said, "Disagreement does not entitle anyone to control another adult's life." He said family is not leverage. Then he faced me and said I was free to leave with my autonomy intact. The gavel's tap was gentle, final, like a door closing softly. We stepped into clear light. Reporters called my name, but I kept my silence and my pace. Nora reached me first and pulled me into a hug that smelled faintly of lemons. She said I was still myself, and I believed her. We walked to Harrington's office, signed for certified copies, and thanked the receptionist who slid the envelope across the counter. Harrington shook my hand and told me I had not flinched. He said that matters. By late afternoon, I was back at the ranch. I brewed tea, set the order beside the silver key, and felt the house exhale. The fences cast long shadows over the pasture. A hawk circled the barn. I whispered to Robert that the law had held and the will he signed guarded our work. The house answered in its language of creaks and settling. Before bed, I placed one certified copy beside the silver key. 2 guardians, one of paper and one of memory. I turned off the lamp and slept, soundly. The days following the final hearing unfolded with a quiet I had not known in months. It wasn't the silence of being ignored or excluded. It was the silence of peace returning to land after heavy rain. I woke on that first morning to the soft whinny of horses outside the barn and the scent of dew lifting from the fields. For the first time in a long while, My chest did not tighten when I looked at the ranch. I brewed my coffee and carried it out to the porch, where the boards seemed to sigh beneath my weight, not from strain, but from relief. The protective order lay on the table beside the silver key, the ink still sharp, the seal pressed deep into paper. I had read it 3 times already, not because I doubted its words, but because they felt like music, steady, firm, and final. I whispered, "We made it, Robert." I meant him, I meant myself, and I meant the ranch that had endured through storms louder than thunder. Neighbors began to visit in small ways. Nora came with jars of jam, her presence gentle as always. She set the jar on the counter, then wrapped me in a hug that said more than words could. Mr. Harlan from the feed store tipped his hat when he drove past, a gesture of quiet solidarity. Even the mailman lingered a moment longer, asking how the horses were. It struck me then how many had been watching silently, waiting to see if I would bend or break. Their eyes carried respect now, not pity. Daniel and Melissa did not come back. I had expected another barrage of calls, another lawyer's letter, another rumor tossed like a stone into the well of town gossip. But for a week, then 2, there was nothing. I imagined them in their house across town, nursing anger, perhaps planning another move. Yet I no longer lived in dread. The will, the ruling, and my own stance had shifted the ground. If they came again, they would find me ready, rooted deeper than before. Each evening I walked the fields slowly, letting memory and present overlap. I saw Robert bending wire on the fence line. I saw Daniel at 10 years old, chasing chickens with laughter bright enough to cut through dust. I saw myself, younger, thinner, standing with hands raw from labor, yet proud of every acre. These visions did not wound me anymore. They reminded me that my life was not defined by courtrooms or betrayals. It was defined by persistence, work done day after day, season after season, with love even when love was not returned. One afternoon, I brought out the old family album. Pages of black and white photos curled at the edges, smiles captured before the weight of years' bent shoulders. There was Robert on our wedding day, his tie crooked, his grin wide. There was Grace holding Daniel as a baby, her eyes bright with pride. There was me, standing in front of a barn, half-finished, hair loose in the wind. I touched each picture as if to say, I remember, I honor, I continue. The storm had passed, but not without cost. Trust, once broken, does not mend easily. I could not pretend Daniel's choices had not cut me deeply. Yet somewhere within me, a seed of hope remained. Maybe one day he would see beyond Melissa's hunger. Maybe he would remember the boy who once ran barefoot across these fields. Until then, my door would stay closed, but not locked to him. Closed for protection, but not locked against the possibility of return. At night, I sat by the window with a cup of chamomile tea, the lamp casting a golden circle over the protective order and the will. The 2 documents lay side by side, guardians of paper and ink. Beyond them, the ranch stretched dark and endless, a horizon I had earned and defended. I thought of the judge's words, "Family is not leverage," and let them echo inside me. They were not just legal truth. They were a kind of scripture, something to live by. The air smelled different after the storm, cleaner, sharper, carrying the promise of growth. I felt it inside me too. I had been bent, but I had not broken. I had learned that silence can be armor, that stillness can be power, that dignity can hold more weight than rage. I was not waiting for anyone's permission to live. When I finally laid down each night, I slept without fear. And in the mornings, I woke ready, not just to endure, but to begin again. The storm had not ended me. It had cleared the sky for me. Peace left room for a new truth. Safety was not the same as purpose. The ranch was protected, yet protection alone did not finish our story. Robert said stewardship means leaving a place better than you found it. The best way to honor that vow was to place land where it could serve more than one family's hunger. I called Mr. Harrington and asked him to arrange a meeting with Land Trust. 2 days later, I met Elena Morales, director of the Gulf Prairie Land and Learning Trust. She listened as I described Robert's hand-set fences, the porch roses, and a boy's kite finally catching wind. I spoke of courtrooms and the will. She let the quiet stand, then said the trust could buy the ranch at fair market value, record a conservation easement, and open it as a teaching ranch with public access days and a simple classroom in the barn. Appraisers walked the fields the next week. The figure arrived typed and plain, $5 million. I felt its weight like a ledger of dawns Robert and I had worked. Harrington reviewed the report and set a timeline that respected law and memory. Nora brought cornbread and asked if I was sure. I said I was. The ranch would live wider this way. We negotiated with care. I asked that the education garden be named for my sister Grace, whose journal taught me steady silence. I asked that the porch remain and the roses be kept, with a small plaque for Robert's belief in stewardship. Elena agreed. A portion of the price would endow scholarships in agricultural science, prioritizing kids told they do not belong in rooms where decisions are made. We added monthly family days and an apprenticeship track for veterans and second-chance workers. Paper moved like seasons, slow at first, then all at once. Title searches returned clean. Trustees signed. I boxed photo albums, the quilt, and Robert's chipped mug. I left most furniture. Classrooms would need sturdy tables, more than I needed ghosts. On the final morning, I brewed tea and walked each room, the silver key warm in my fist. Elena arrived with 2 staffers and a locksmith. We stood in the kitchen where so many choices had been made. She set the deed on the table beside a fountain pen and waited. I read each page as an extension of a promise. When I signed, the pen scratched like a plow opening a furrow. Elena signed next. Harrington notarized. No champagne, no applause. Only the soft settling that follows a right decision. I carried the key outside. The sun was merciful, the wind easy. Nora stood by the truck, eyes bright. I placed the key in Elena's palm. Its weight seemed to surprise her. "This belongs to many now," I said. She nodded and closed her fingers as if accepting a living thing. Before leaving, I walked to the south fence. The bench was not there yet, but the light already knew where to land. I pressed my hand to the post Robert set decades ago and let memory slow into prayer. Thank you for the work, the years, the lessons that hurt and healed. When I turned back, the porch looked less like an ending and more like a threshold. Daniel called that evening. "Melissa says you sold the ranch." "I placed it where it can do the most good," I answered. He asked whether anything remained for him. I told him the only thing I owed was truth, and I had given that freely. If he wanted to learn care, the Grace Garden would welcome volunteers. He was quiet a long time, then said, "Maybe I will come by." I promised nothing beyond listening. Funds arrived by wire the next day. Harrington executed the scholarship endowment, and moved the remainder into accounts that let me live without fear or apology. I wrote one quiet check to a group that defends elders from financial abuse, and another to the public library for a reading room. No press releases. Some gifts work best without names. That night, I slept in Nora's guest room, boxes stacked by the door. The ranch did not vanish when I left. It expanded. Its gates would open for field trips, apprenticeships, and families who needed a wide sky to remember they belong to something that does not break when people fail them. Paper can wound, but it can also heal. This time, it healed. In the morning, I held the silver key one last time. I kissed it and set it in a cedar box beside Grace's journal. The box would come with me to the coast. The land would stay, teaching what it has always taught. Real inheritance is not possession. It is responsibility shared, widened, and passed forward like light. When the papers were signed and the funds wired, I thought the emptiness would hit me like a blow. After all, the ranch had been my lungs for decades, the air I breathed. But instead of emptiness, what arrived was space, wide, uncluttered, filled with possibility. It was as if the storm that nearly drowned me had also cleared a field for planting. I moved into a modest cottage near the coast, a small place with wide windows that opened toward the water. Nora helped me carry boxes, setting them gently on the hardwood floors. She teased that I was finally downsizing like I had threatened to do for years. We laughed, and the sound echoed strangely, bright and new. That night, I stood on the porch and listened to the waves. Their rhythm was steady, like breath. I whispered, "It's never too late." The first weeks were strange. I woke early, expecting to hear the restless stir of horses or the creak of the barn door, only to find gulls crying overhead. I no longer wore work boots at dawn. I wore soft slippers and brewed coffee slowly, watching the steam rise without urgency. At first, I felt guilty for the ease. Then, I realized ease was not betrayal. Ease was survival's gift. I unpacked only what mattered. Grace's journal lay on the bedside table, Robert's mug on the shelf, and the cedar box with the silver key inside the dresser drawer. The rest stayed in cartons, reminders that I didn't need to fill every wall to feel whole. Some evenings, I read aloud from Grace's journal, as if she were still beside me. Her words, about silence, presence, and dignity, carried even more weight now that I had lived them through fire. I visited the ranch a month after the sale. Elena walked me through the new classroom in the barn, where children painted pictures of chickens and asked questions about soil. The Grace garden was already sprouting herbs and tomatoes, a simple wooden sign carrying my sister's name. I touched the wood and felt tears sting my eyes, not from sorrow, but from recognition. The land was breathing differently now, and it was beautiful. Daniel came once, alone. He didn't step far from his truck, but he removed his hat and asked how I was. I told him I was well. He said Melissa didn't understand why I had given the ranch away. I told him I hadn't given it away. I had given it forward. He didn't answer, but his eyes softened before he left. I didn't chase him. I had learned not all roads back to family are paved in my lifetime. Sometimes, the invitation itself is enough. In my new life, I began volunteering twice a week at the library, reading stories to children who sat cross-legged on rugs, their faces tilted up in wonder. Some had never touched a book outside of school. When I watched their fingers trace the pictures, I thought of stewardship again. This was land of another kind, words, pages, imaginations, and I could still be its keeper. One evening, I brewed chamomile tea and sat by the window. The sea stretched dark and endless, stars threading silver across the waves. I opened Grace's journal to a line I had underlined years ago. The end of one story is not silence, it is an opening. I closed the book and whispered back, I understand now. What had begun as a fight to keep something had transformed into a decision to release it. In the letting go, I discovered myself. Still strong, still present, still capable of beginning again at 70 years old. Not broken, not bitter, just quieter, and perhaps wiser. I thought of the women who would hear my story, women told they were too old, too forgotten, too small to matter. I wanted them to know. It is never too late to redraw the map of your life. Never too late to say no. Never too late to start again. The waves answered, rolling in and out, as if repeating the truth. I raised my cup of tea, not in farewell, but in salute to what was coming. A life not measured by what I lost, but by what I had chosen. And in that moment, I knew. The storm had not marked my ending. It had cleared the sky for my beginning. I have told you my story as faithfully as memory allows. A woman who once believed silence meant invisibility, and who learned instead that silence could be a boundary, a shield, even a voice louder than shouting. I was Catherine Clark, wife, mother, widow, and finally, the keeper of a ranch that became more than land. It became a mirror. It showed me my strengths, my blind spots, and the hard truth that family is not defined by entitlement. When I think back on the courtroom, the accusations, the whispers, and the betrayal that cut deeper than any blade, I no longer feel shame. I feel recognition. Recognition that life gives us storms not to end us, but to strip away what is false, so that we can stand clearer in who we are. Selling the ranch was not losing, it was planting. The land will outlive me, teaching children who never knew my name. That is legacy, not ownership. I share this with you not to dwell on wounds, but to remind you, it is never too late to start again. I was 70 when I chose to stand, 70 when I chose to say no more, 70 when I chose to let go. If I had waited for permission, I would still be waiting. Instead, I stood, trembling but unbroken, and discovered strength that had been mine all along. Perhaps you, listening now, carry a weight that others do not see. Perhaps you have given and given, only to be treated as if your worth expired. Maybe someone told you you're too old to begin again, too weak to set boundaries, too small to make change. Hear me when I say, those are lies. The truth is simpler. You still belong to yourself. Your voice still matters. Your choices still count. If my story has stirred something in you, anger, grief, recognition, don't turn away from it. Sit with it. Ask yourself what condition you need to set, what line you need to draw, what dream you have postponed because you believed the chance had passed. The chance has not passed. The clock may be moving, but courage is not measured by years. It is measured by steps. One step to say no. One step to say yes. One step to begin again. I will not pretend the road was easy. I lost pieces of family. I lost illusions. I lost nights of sleep. But in losing those things, I gained clarity. And clarity is worth more than comfort. It is worth more than inheritance. It is worth the freedom to breathe as yourself. To those who walk with pain similar to mine, you are not alone. I may never know your names, but I know your silence. I know your quiet tears. And I know you carry strength enough to rise. Now, before we part, I want to leave you with this. If you have ever faced betrayal from those closest to you, or felt the sting of being dismissed because of your age, your gender, your quiet nature, share your story. Leave it here in the comments. Not because you owe anyone explanation, but because your voice can meet another voice, and together they become a chorus. We heal when we speak, and we heal when we listen. And if my journey has spoken to you, I ask something simple. Subscribe, so you can walk with me in the stories still to come. Like this video, not for me, but for the women and men who need to find it. And turn on the notification bell, so that when the next story rises, you will be here at the beginning, not at the end. Because beginnings matter. And this moment, this connection, this breath you take as you listen, is proof that it is never too late. I close now with the same words I whispered to myself on nights when fear tried to take root. Didn't I mention the condition? The condition is not about land or money or property. It is about dignity. And dignity is yours to keep, no matter what storms come. So let us end here, not in silence, but in strength. My name is Catherine Clark. This was my story. And perhaps, in some small way, it is yours too.